So thank you for the advertisement of my very small website. You can have more in the Institute website. I will show you at the end of my presentation. But first of all, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And sorry I chickened out for the party last night, but I was a bit tired and thought I might not be too tired today if I chicken out at 10, and so I hope you will appreciate that, the effort I did. And to start with, I want to echo the British humor that Graham brought up today with some of the local humor where I come from, that is southern Germany. And I chose this little picture for my presentation that is saying something about inequalities and transitions to work in my country. So if you can read it, I read it like that. The small writing over there is jihad, and the bigger writing, the more recent one, is saying better do an apprenticeship first. So that's one reading. The other reading is that this is taken, is effing the local dialect that is nowadays more associated with old people, and is echoing the huge pressure young people get in Germany to do an apprenticeship, to enter vocational training. So that's the central line of inequality in our system of transitions to work in Germany, is like whether you manage to enter the apprenticeship system or whether you're not. When you're in there, it's quite safe. You will have a high chance of getting a job. If you're not in there, you will struggle for years. And but my presentation is today is about inequalities in young people's transitions and the dilemmas of dealing with it in a reflective practice and research. And I'm happy to speak after Kate, who laid the floor for a good notion of what inequality can do and what harm can do the stereotype threat. So I don't have to argue why is it important for us in outreach and youth work to be aware of these inequalities and find a reflective way of dealing with them. So, not working. Okay. So the aims of my presentation this morning are, I will show you some constructions of ethnicity and inequalities as an example of this dilemma situation, that we need to know about all the inequalities, and we need to not know them in practice and maybe forget about them. I will show you one way of dealing with it in a reflective way, and I will discuss some of the findings I found in a recent study I've been doing, and I will introduce that to you. And I will show you how diversity management can be bad for you. There's a British author who found out about how diversity management can contribute to the stereotype threat that Kate has been talking about. But first of all, I show you my perspective, who is speaking. First of all, we need to know about Germany that the most prominent feature of our education and training system in Germany is the early selection of young people at the age of 10 or 12 into different channels of education. So inequalities already produced and predicted at the age of 10 or 12. And then you have the already mentioned importance of the dual system of vocational training, the apprenticeship system, which is a good thing. We have officially very low unemployment rates among young people, but if you're not in there, you're really in a bad situation. And one feature that we share with a lot of European countries is that migration background has become the main line of interpretation of inequalities in education and training. It's not only since the PISA study days, but this has gained some prominence in several countries in Europe. But in Germany, this is the main line, I'd say, of explaining social inequality and reproduction of social inequality in education and training. So I've been showing a double link between ethnicity and inequality in transitions to work in some older work. That is, you are suffering from that kind of stereotype threat already at the education system. So you're already harmed by that, and you carry that on, and then you hit the labor market, where you might be hit by this direct discrimination. So there's a double link between ethnicity or ascribed ethnicity in the German system, between inequality and all these features or assumptions about young people with an ethnic minority background. I will show you about the underlying study right now, but one starting point for my study was like echoing also Graham's question for this afternoon's workshop: who are the young people you are working with, and how do you know? You know, I'm not a youth worker anymore. I'm not an outreach worker anymore. That's quite a long time ago I've been one. But I cannot claim that any longer. So I'm working with teams of outreach and youth workers as a consultant mainly, or practice researcher. So naturally, when they first meet me, they keep their distance a bit, because he doesn't have a clue of our work. And they're right. Well, of course, I don't have a clue of their work. But when we work a bit together and we develop mutual trust, there almost stereotypically comes out this one sentence. That is, when they gain trust in our work together, they tell me, hey, come on, Axel, you know how our kids are. So that's, in 90% of all the cases I work with teams of outreach workers or youth workers, is when they get to know me and see he's not so far off the reality as a researcher, they tell me, Axel, you know how these kids are. And this has a huge impact on how they are looking at their kids and how they are working with them. So my usual answer is, no, I don't, and you better don't either. Yes. So I will talk about some subtle ways of othering processes that are involved when you talk benevolently to young people with your goodwill. Like, this is from a campaign of Oxford students recently about the hidden racism that they face even in an institution like Oxford University. And you might all be familiar to this situation. Oh, your English is great. Oh, thanks, I was born in London. Where do you come from? I'm from Oslo. But where do you come really from? So you know these subtle forms of othering, of making people, dividing the world in we and you. So that's what my presentation is about, and think of some ways of how can we avoid that, how can we avoid that in an error-friendly way, and how can we manage to find a reflective practice to deal with these stereotypes, othering processes. The underlying study is a small one. I've recently completed it. It's about the reconstruction of ethnicity in discourses, institutional arrangements, policies, and practices. It was a qualitative, multi-level analysis I did, and I chose France and UK as comparative cases, looking from a German perspective at the UK and France. How do youth workers, outreach workers, advisors in transitions to work co-construct and reconstruct ethnicity? I've done that in doing narrative interviews with 29 practitioners, just to reconstruct their practices. And I applied a very wide and open enough notion of ethnicity. There was like every assumed difference based on nation, ethnicity, or culture is, for me, is meant by this, in quotation mark, ethnicity. And the special method I use to reconstruct practices is narrative interviews. That is an interview approach you're using with a very open question. Please tell me about your work. I don't know anything about it. And you try to generate narrations, bring people closer to situations than they can remember, to actual situations, and not like if you ask them, what does ethnicity mean for you? They will reproduce their school knowledge, their knowledge at best from university. But if you ask them to tell stories of what they are doing in their everyday work, you will come closer to what they're actually doing and what their professional knowledge is in an applied form. So I will show you some results, some examples of how these categories of difference are at work and how they are at work in particular contexts. I asked myself how these notions of inequality that the practitioners are producing are interwoven with these categories they put onto their young people. And finally, we have to ask ourselves, how do these accounts of practitioners and the other levels, like discourses, national and institutional frames, relate to each other, in order to find out what can we do in practice, what can be a reflective way of dealing with it. But before I go into the details of like the ethnicity and race and nation-based differences, to show you the dilemma that we are in youth work and outreach work, is that labels can be very useful. Labels and categories we put to young people help us to scandalize the life situations of young people. And one example for that is like the recently crazed need category that is spreading. Its origin is in the UK, where researchers like Howard Williamson pointed out to the situation of young people who are not in education, employment or training. He called them the status zero youth. But that has become one of the policy priorities for the UK government and is spreading all over Europe right now as a new category of young people we should take care of. And there's one quote from a youth worker, a detached worker in the UK, saying, so there's a massive agenda to tackle the need issue, but there's a whole variety of reasons why young people would be need in the first place. And for me, one of the big reasons is that our education system is so static. There's one way of teaching our children and young people, but there's so many different learning styles, and the learning styles generally aren't catered for. So we already have there a critical stance towards this need category, because on the one hand side, it's very useful to have a label that is speaking to enhance our struggle for getting funding for youth work, for outreach work. On the other hand, there's the danger that these labels will become containers for young people. And I can quickly show you an overview of who is in that need situation in the Labour Force Survey 2010 compared to the EU 15. The UK and France were very close. So there's a whole political agenda setting around why need right now becomes such a big political issue. It's not very much based on the UK being far off other countries with their numbers, but it's very similar to France and to the EU average. So I think I'm talking about ethnicity and all that nation, culture, and so forth based categories, but I think it can be applied to a wider field of which categories do we use, and can we use them in a reflective way without falling into the trap of taking categories for people, or people putting people into containers. So one example of how practitioners take up given categories is from an interview with an advisor from Mission Locale in France, that is a nationwide structure to give information, advice, guidance to young people with some certain issues in their transitions to work. And this particular advisor tells me, after a long narration about how she is working with young people and the different types of advice processes she can do with these young people, she comes at the very end of this long narration, she says, and then there's this difference between, very generally, male and female clients. The girls have a tendency to be more mature earlier, and we manage to get something going more easily. With the boys, it is usually more complicated and takes longer. It is also due to the Maghrebian culture that puts them on a pedestal, so they don't get bothered until they're 23, 24, and it's time to get married. So this worker could have referred to like the family structures in her neighborhood. She could have referred to the stigma that is put to this particular banlieue area that puts young people in a difficult situation of relating to something like labor market. She could have referred to the education system in France, that young women are dealing far better in a certain segment with than young men. But here she's referring to the Maghrebian culture. So why does she do that? My interpretation of that is she's dealing with an organizational problem. The mission locale can be very different in every city in France, and in this particular city, it is like they take appointments with young people. Young people have to stick to a certain time to come, they have to make an appointment before they get advice. So her problem, she tries to explain by culture, is an organizational problem. It's her organization's approach that makes it difficult for young men with a certain self-image to follow this prescribed way of getting something going. You need to come several times, you have to develop the patience, you have to develop the frustration tolerance to work with her. An outreach worker would have had different problems, but she has an organizational problem she's solving by, it might be the Maghrebian culture, that we don't get so far with the boys than with the girls. And so there's a couple of reasons and mechanisms that makes us use differences that we find around us. It's not youth workers who invent those categories, of course, but there's national frames. So in my study there was the comparison between France and the UK is quite evident. You have what Robert Castel has called la discrimination négative. That is a particular French way of dealing with racism. It's like, it's taboo. You don't talk about race. You don't talk about ethnicity. You talk about citizens and maybe area and banlieue, but you don't talk about race. And that some other writers have been writing about racism without races. So that contrasts largely with the UK, where, okay, I know the old race relations model has gone, but the categories are still there. So race is something you can say in the UK. In France, they would look down to you if you mention race, and not speaking of Germany, of course. So there's national frames that give us certain categories to think along, and there's taboos risen in certain national frames. But of course, organizational frames also give us, you have a mandate when you're an outreach worker. Sometimes it's a mandate, take care of these black young men in your neighborhood because they're doing not so well at school. So it can be a problem solver, like we saw in the example of the French advisor. It can also be generate legitimation. You know, I'm teaching at university, I'm teaching social workers, and they have to do a practice placement for half a year, and they have to bring back a report on their practice placement. And stereotypically, the first sentence, especially from youth workers or community workers, is, we have 80% of people with a migration background in that neighborhood. That's why we are there. Of course, they have to learn, they're still studying, but that can be found in reports by professionals as well. So it's creating legitimation. Why are you there? Okay, we have 80% of people with a migration background, saying nothing about the social problems that might prevail in that neighborhood. But we use it because we can trigger the funding trigger with saying, oh, you know, 80%, that's quite a lot. We need the money. And of course, there's discursive frames that are not only given by media or by like a common sense culture, but also by research. In my interviews, many people, they are all trained, they all have a degree. They were not referring to blunt prejudices or stereotypes. They were giving me numbers. They were giving me statistics. So the reference to research often is like a shortcut. So I will show you why this is often misunderstood. Because the standard model of researching the reproduction of inequalities often does this that way. We often put like an input side where we put all the determinants of social inequality or whatever we put as the dependent variable. We put gender, cultural capital, ethnicity as the independent variables we are looking for, and we put like the education system, interventions in social work, in youth work, as intermittent variables, as the mechanisms that reproduce social inequality. And on the other side, we have some output, like in my field, it's certificates, educational performance, it might be positions on the labor market. So that's the standard model in sociology of education to look for the reproduction of social inequality. So we look at this side as a given. Gender, cultural capital, ethnicity is a given. And we look how does it relate to the output side. So to challenge that view, we have to go to an alternative way of looking at differences. And it has pretty much to do with social positioning. So one quotation puts that quite well. It's taken from a book by Sangeeta Soni from the UK. And she quotes a schoolgirl from Bradford saying, "When I'm standing in the school playground with my English friends, I am black. When an African Caribbean girl joins our group, I become Asian. When another Asian girl comes in, I think of myself as Pakistani and Muslim. When a Pakistani friend joins us, I become Kashmiri. And when another Kashmiri girl turns up, I become a Bradford schoolgirl again." So I think that illustrates well that is a social positioning process is a social process. It takes place in certain situations. It takes place dependent on the context. You're not free to choose. She's not free to choose of thinking of herself of anything, but she anticipates the relationship that she will have to the other girls, to her friends. So it's a highly relational and social process to make these categories. And of course they're not random, but they're embedded in power relationships. It's always a power relationship. Who can choose whether one category is relevant in a given situation or not? So it's mostly the more powerful side who can decide, does gender matter here? No, I didn't mean it. No, I didn't mean it. It's not about gender. when I'm walking in the street and whistling after women? I can choose. No, I didn't mean it. So it's power related, but it's embedded into a social relation, and it's not simply there. It's not a given. So some of you might be familiar to thinking of Judith Butler, putting it, gender is not something you are, it's something you do. So I think this is true for all the differences we're dealing with, all the categories we're dealing with. It's not something young people are, it's something they do or we do in our social relationship with them. So we rather look at this model again and see what a reflective model of looking at inequalities might be. And to my reading, we should go back to, like, of course, oops, sorry. We look here at the life worlds of young people. They are wider than the categories. And our institutional view categorizes individuals. We are there with a mandate to deal with a special group of people, and so we generate these groups. We categorize them as gender does matter here. We especially are aware of cultural capital now. It's especially striking how this is used in the sociology of education all over Europe now. They all refer to Pierre Bourdieu's work and say, oh, this cultural capital these immigrant families have is just not enough. They're not investing enough in education. If you think back of what Bourdieu wrote, is cultural capital is the product of a social process where certain social classes imposed their meanings of what culture is on other social classes. So it's quite astonishing that in the sociology of education they're all quoting Bourdieu with cutting the social side of it. Like they make cultural capital something that people carry around in a rucksack. No, it's not. It's just institutions looking at them and valuing some things as high cultural capital and some things as low. So it's not something people have or are. It's what we make of them is cultural capital. And ethnicity is very much the same. So, what to do? What can we do as ground workers, as outreach workers, as youth workers? These categories are powerful. They are there. We have to deal with them. So, one quotation from an advisor from the Connections service in UK. Don't know whether it exists still in these days, but 2 years ago when I was interviewing them, they were still there. And one replied, she was mentioning BME as a central category to her work, as central to her mandate to work with BME people. So I asked, so you're saying BME, young people, what does that mean? And she says, all different. There's asylum seekers, there's refugees, there's Somali young people, there's British-born black people, there's mixed-race black people, all sorts. There's Polish people. You know, BME is a huge spectrum. Anybody who's not English, isn't it? She laughs, falls on the BME. This is black and minority ethnic, so it is. So you see, this is, she unfolds a whole spectrum of categories here. One is like your legal status, asylum seeker. There's migration, reasons for migration, like refugees. There's Somali young people, refers to a country of origin. There's British-born origin, black, color of skin, pigmentation, whatever. There's mixed-race black people. So she unfolds a whole range of categories that have nothing to do with BME as the official mandate she has. So what she's doing, she's distancing herself. She's taking a critical stance to her own mandate, saying, okay, we got the label BME, but I know in my neighborhood we have all kinds of constellations of people, of life situations. And the laughter is like she's deconstructing it in the deconstructionist way. She's taken Arnie as a weapon. Like, I have to take this serious because I'm paid for working with BME people. But I can laugh at it, and I know it's wrong. Life is much more colorful than BME or not. So I think one way of reflectively dealing with these categories is knowing how they shape the world around us. And Kate has shown how massive the impact is of some inequality, income-related. But don't let them become features of people. Don't let them become containers. So that's one way of avoiding containers in my reading. Another way is advocacy. There's been much talk about that. I know that in all outreach discourses, nationally and internationally, about advocacy. And I think one outreach worker in Germany raised that point in a very good fashion. He said, where in our society do young people have the opportunity to reflect on the demands of the labor market? Young people need a space where they can actively deal with this clash. Why do you need A-levels to work in a bakery? They need a concrete person to talk about this injustice, and maybe they'll accept, okay, this is unjust, but I need to look for something else. If they are confronted to this anonymously, they just perceive it as a personal offense by society. And I think this is what I would say the more important point, like making inequality and injustice part of your work. Where in society do young people have someone to talk about that? They need a person to echo that. Why is it that with my school certificate, my leaving certificate, I cannot do anything besides crap jobs? So I think outreach work should be aware of, like, okay, we have to deal in a reflective way with these inequalities, with avoiding categorizations, avoiding containers, but also provide a space where this can be negotiated with the young people. So, to sum that up, what can be a reflective practice in dealing with inequalities and differences and categories? First, you have to understand and reflect your own practice in a way that it is part of social boundary making, of inclusion and exclusion in societies. Your mandate tells you where maybe your world should end. So you have to be aware of that. And like the quote from the advisor from the Connections Service, you can distance yourself. You can use irony, use humor. And this is not meant to propose be more strict with yourself. This is my pledge would be more error-friendly in your work. Don't know who your young people are, maybe. So, second point is make inequality a topic with your young people. I don't think we need to invent new methods for that. You have these everyday situations where young people come up with the application forms they have to fill in and things like that. That's a huge opportunity to talk with them about inequality and injustice. And of course there's been a lot of talk, and most of you might have had already intercultural training and things like that, or intercultural personal skills included in your studies. I think this is not enough. It's fine, but of course we need the structural level, like participation and representation gives a whole other picture. Like in the UK, my interview partners, they told me, oh, we got this group, LBGT and so forth, young people are organizing themselves. So it's not only the workers who take care of representation, it's included in a structural level. We don't have that in many cities in Germany. And in France, I don't know. So that's an important level. We have to have these groups. Okay, there's the danger of essentializing certain categories. If you have a BME group in your youth council, that might be essentializing the category. But it also provides young people with statutory rights. They can propose something to the city council, and they're represented. And as we heard from Kate, the stereotype threat is like the fear of being judged. So if you have a right that you can impose, I have a right to be there, I have a right to have a say, I think that's a major impact we can make. And of course, beyond these intercultural personal skills, you need different pairs of glasses. You know, I'm struggling here with my glasses, but you need different glasses. Of course, in some situations, you might need culture as a pair of glasses to interpret a young person's situation. At other times, you might just need others, like adolescence, puberty, or whatever. You might need a youth theory pair of glasses, and you might need area or neighborhood or community work pair of glasses. So you need all kinds of different glasses to work in your with the young people and not put them into categories that become containers. But the essential part is, I think, that we need a reflexive notion of inequality, like I sketched it roughly. We need to know that inequality is not there. It's not something in the person. It's something that is made in society. Of course, I'm not saying to you, talk nicely to them and inequality will go away. But we have to be aware that inequality is a social process. It's not in the person. So I think this should be very much part of the professional self-understanding of outreach workers, to know about how inequality is reproduced and reflect, or being able to reflect on their own part in that play. Okay. So research has a job to do there as well, I think. First is, of course, critical reflection on own categories. Sometimes they come from the government, of course. Funded research is a huge problem. If we cut down on universities and normal research, it will become huger as a problem. And one step would be to de-ethnicize research designs. Why is PISA as a study asking for migration background and not any other category? Could be many other categories there. So if you are looking for ethnicity, you will find ethnicity. So you have to de-ethnicize research designs. And one way is, of course, to strengthen qualitative designs, like reconstruct the processes of how categories are being produced in youth work, in social work, in outreach work, instead of looking at these groups as given. And of course, mixed methods and triangulation are good strategies of developing research pairs of glasses. Like, look at one thing from different angles, take different sources of data, take different teams looking at the same sources. So this is all some ideas what the job of research can be in, like being more sensitive to how these categories of social inequalities are used and reproduced in research and practice. So these are the references. You don't need to write them because you will have the PDF from the website. And I thank you. I cannot pronounce it, but you can read it. Stay in touch. Thank you.